April is all about assessment. So, in this pre session, you are going to understand the differences, hopefully, between summative and formative assessment. Take some time to do some serious, deep reflection on what formative and summative assessment look like in your classroom, and then also reflect back on some current practices of assessment and feedback. Take a moment to answer these questions to help guide your learning today around assessment. And what and when are these goals met? And then also think about how are these goals met? So when are you assessing to determine and monitor student progress? What does that look like in your classroom and when do you do it or how often? What is the purpose of comparing students or to influence our instruction or to evaluate? And evaluate, I would also like you to pause and think about what and when does this happen? And how much instructional time are we devoting to assessment? And how and when are we doing that? Our mathematical teaching practices are at the heart of assessment. Our first one, right off the bat, is establishing math learning goals. In order for us to think about assessment and what we want to assess, students need to know where they are and where they are going, or what they don't know yet. So, how this all kind of goes together is linking assessment and feedback all into our standards walls. We want students to be able to retain and organize the feedback that we give them as well as giving each other. So, standards walls, they set our learning target. They also help guide students throughout the entire lesson on where they are and what they don't know yet. Also, kind of naming the different types of complexities of levels of learning, for instance, naming a task mild or medium or spicy helps label the task or the complexity of a topic and not a student. So that would be something to be mindful of when you're thinking about assessment is how are we giving that feedback to students? Um, Also, this math teaching practice helps students see the continuum of learning so that it's clear and they know the next steps, and that we as teachers are being extremely transparent with our students so that they can feel successful and powerful in our classroom.
Oh, John, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And first of all, I do want to say a huge thank you for writing the foreword to this book. I am so happy that you agreed to do that. I had a chat with Dylan William about it, and he said because he'd edited it and it was about his work, he felt it'd be a self-endorsement. And I said, I'd love John Hattie to do it. And he said, if John would do it, that would be incredible. And you agreed.
Well, it's a great book, Kate. There's so much spoken about the whole topic, and I'm sure, like Dylan and you, I get very frustrated at the misunderstandings of that area. So to get something in one place that gets it right is kind of wonderful. So it was a pleasure to read, and it was a pleasure to write.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, and you've done lots of work with formative assessment because you've worked with Shirley Clark and you've done loads of work with feedback. And one of the first things I wanted to talk about from the forward, you made a really good point about the myths, the misunderstandings, and it's about if only the term had been called formative evaluation instead of formative assessment. So why do you think that would be a better phrase term?
Well, that's actually how it was invented. Like Michael Scriven invented it, over 50 years ago, and he was trying to make the distinction between what you do during an evaluation and what you do at the end. And it's a matter of timing. It's not a matter of different kinds of assessment. And then Ben Bloom picked up the idea without acknowledgement, actually, and switched it to testing. And so the whole thing has been focused around testing. And that was never its intent. And I should say, Kate, Michael has been one of my mentors, my colleagues. The two things I'm most proud of in my career is that for 15 years, I was his boss and I'm his referee. And he's now 96, and we're actually writing a book together at the moment. I'm not sure I'll be doing that at 96, but he's an amazing human individual. But he invented those terms, and the phrase, when the cook tastes the soup, it's formative. When the guest tastes the food, it's summative. But because it's got tied up in the testing movement, people think it's about giving tests during a session, the end of the session. And like you say throughout the book, It's the interpretations you make that then lead to consequential decisions. And I think that's the big argument there. And so I'm a great fan of formative and summative ideas, but the minute you put the word testing in there, I'm not a fan at all, because it just negates the whole benefits. What I'm doing at the moment, Kate, is we've been writing a lot recently about the essence of the thinking amongst teachers and school leaders. And the concept we're using is evaluative thinking, how you make evaluative decisions. And the word in there is really critical, is value. And it comes very closely aligned with formative and summative. It's the same kind of notions, but we don't want to use the word testing. Here's the irony. I spent 50 years of my career as a psychometrician in measurement. I love the measurement side of things, but more importantly, it's the interpretations we make. And that's what goes right throughout what you've written about. And it ties in directly to what Dylan's been saying also for the last many, many years.
Yeah, Dylan and Tom Sherrington both loved the forward, thought it was brilliant. Something that I really liked when I was reading it, and I'm just going to quote it so I don't mess it up. So this is what you said. Students are often asked to all get on the bus, being driven by the teacher somewhere, but not necessarily knowing where to, and then being asked to get off at the end of the lesson. Schooling should be more like Uber driving, the destination clear from the outset, and then the focus on moving from where they are now to where they need to be, and there are multiple ways and times to get there. And I just love that. You always have a great way with words, John. So do you want to just, that's about the first strand, is about sharing, clarifying, understanding, learning intentions and success criteria, which have got a really bad name, a bad rep, and teachers think that it could be a waste of time. But again, you and Dylan have spoken a lot about this, about why it's so important, isn't it?
There's a lot of debate at the moment, certainly here in Australia, about learning progressions. And I get very frustrated with the notion, because it's usually a group of educators get together and decide what the right way to go from A to B is. That's not how kids learn. Like, kids learn in multiple ways, they have multiple directions. And like, if you're traveling from London to Scotland, I'm sure most people would go up the M whatever it is, but some would go around through Newcastle, some would go up through Birmingham, best place in the world, because that's where I discovered my wife, but that's another story. But there's multiple ways to get from one place to the other. But most people put progressions as if there's one way. And so this is why this Uber driver notion that there's multiple ways to get there. And that is actually the true concept of differentiation. Multiple ways and multiple times. But sadly, many teachers think differentiation is different activities for different groups. And it's just not the case. It's like COVID at the moment. We're all worried about certain kinds of kids. Well, those labeling we put to kids is not necessarily applicable to all those kids. How do you do great diagnosis, great discovery? How do you set those success criteria so that they're not too hard, not too easy, not too boring? And then teaching and feedback, assessment is all the information that gets you each student from A to B, but not always on the same route. And that's why the whole bus analogy is so destructive. And like, some person invented many years ago the notion that kids should be at certain ages in classes, as if all the kids at that age are the same. That's just not the case. So I think we've got to be a lot more adaptable, a lot more systematic in our discovery. And that's where what you've written about in that book, about how you could use all that information as feedback to the teacher about where the kids start, where they end up, and how they get there.
Yeah. And that's the point I've tried to make. When I started teaching, it said you have to achieve this by the end of the lesson. But then you made the point about the Uber, where you might stop off for McDonald's. And that's because learning, we don't know always how long it will take. And it does take us in different directions. And that really helped me. And another point that you made that links in what you've just said is about teachers becoming better listeners, or listening more. And it's the greatest, a real sign of respect to show students if we listen to them more. And that's something that I thought, actually, I'm aware of, but I probably need to do that more in the classroom. And do you think that that's true of a lot of teachers?
Actually, my partner Janet did a study in actually just north of Birmingham. It started, but throughout the UK, using an app that she's developed that you turn it on, you teach your class, and at the end it gives you a transcript, 99% accurate of what you've said. It also does a lot of AI stuff behind and gives you lots of dimensions from Matt Mazzano and Danielson, etc. Just about 17 to 20,000 teachers who have done this. And one of the things that's striking is 89% of the time, teachers are talking.
Wow.
And they ask 150 to 200 questions a day that require less than 3 words response. Kids ask on average about a class asks on average about 11 questions per day. 2 about their misunderstanding or their work. So how can you possibly hear your impact, make decisions in light of where the kids are on that urban journey if you're talking so much? I was trained many, many years ago as a Rogerian counsellor, and Carl Rogers had a deep imprint on me. And his basic argument was that counselling starts with deep listening. And that means you not only listen, but you demonstrate to Kate that I have heard what you've said. And I do think it's an incredible mark of respect to a human being when, like, you've given me the luxury of being able to read your book. I've actually read how you think. That's a luxury. And so I hope I'm a good listener that way. But it's that notion of that ability to listen. And think of feedback. Isn't feedback a way of listening? And we take a very strong argument that feedback that's not heard, understood, or actionable is probably of little use. And so once again, how do the students listen to us? And so I think listening, and I like to, maybe your next book between the three of you should be about listening. I think it's a really powerful notion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something that I'll take away. And you mentioned feedback, and this for me is the biggest similarity that you and Dylan have. You've both written a lot about feedback, and you're both always sort of, I think, sharing the same key messages. But when I see schools and I work with them and they talk about feedback, the questions tend to focus on, should it be verbal or written? Should it be immediate or delayed? What color pen? Well, the pen thing we're moving away from, but that's not actually when you and Dylan are talking about feedback. That's not what you have at the agenda. It is like, well, the key thing I think that I've taken away from your work is the actionable element of it, isn't it? And how do we do that as teachers? How do we? Well, the students have got to listen to the feedback as well, haven't they? They have to hear.
No. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there, does it make a noise? If you give feedback to a student and it's not heard, understood, and actionable, was it feedback? Well, of course it was, because it was given. But I think the focus that Dylan has taken, and I've certainly followed, looking at how it's received, and certainly how it's received not only by the student as they receive feedback, but also by the teacher as he or she receives feedback. And like when we look at the analysis of Janet's work, like, teachers give an incredible amount of feedback, but that's not the point. Is we need to better understand how it is heard, understood, and listened. And like we make this very strong claim, and I know Dylan's been making this too, is about maybe we should stop and ask the students, what did they understand by the feedback we gave them? That might be the most powerful ways for us to understand the effectiveness of our feedback. And as you said, Kate, whether it's written, whether it's marks, whether it's done immediately or following, it's about the effectiveness of it, not about the form of it. I think we've got a bit obsessed. And I have to admit, I've spent too much time in my career looking at teachers giving feedback and not students and teachers receiving feedback. And then it comes back to what you just said. That's incredibly skilled listening. And so I think, yes, that whole part, but feedback still is powerful. But the dilemma, as we've known for many years, is that it's very variable. And that variability is kind of resolved when you look at it through the recipient's point of view. And when we ask students what kind of feedback they want to know how to move forward. Whereas we give a lot of feedback about where they've been. And in some ways, nothing wrong with that, as long as it also leads them forward. We've just done a study looking at 3,000 students' computer-based feedback that they got after they first submitted their assignment, and then 2 or 3 months later when they then finally submitted their assignment. And the biggest predictor of success, let me make it more blunt, the biggest success of their improvement was improvement feedback. Surprise, surprise. But when you look at most feedback, it isn't about improvement.
Mm.
So I think this is really, and going back to the testing movement, if tests don't lead to improvements, that formative notion, they probably are of little value to the students.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about, because there's 5 strategies, and the third one's feedback, but then the fourth one is about students as learners, activating as learning resources for one another. Peer feedback can be really powerful in the classroom, but it's quite hard to get that right. Something I spoke to Dylan about was that students say, "But I want your feedback, miss." And he said, well, actually, they're right to say that, because you're the teacher, you're the professional in the classroom, and they trust your judgment perhaps more than the person sat next to them. So that's something that I've definitely explored in the classroom, and the work of Ron Berger that he's done with it being kind, specific and helpful has been really useful in my classroom. But yeah, it's not easy to get peer feedback and assessment to have that impact in the classroom. Do you think we should be promoting that, or what are your views on the peer support?
Well, I think that you're right. We want feedback from experts because novices don't know what they don't know. But the other distinction that I'd make is that peers can be very good at giving feedback for improvement, but they should never be involved in grading.
Mm-hmm.
Grading is the responsibility of the teacher because of their expert views about what they know and what they don't know, whereas their peers don't always not know what they don't know. And so I'm a fan of peer feedback. Like, for example, in our doctoral program here in Melbourne, before the students are allowed to hand anything into us, they have to have it critiqued by 2 of their peers. They hand in the critique plus their final assignment, plus an outline, a letter saying how they reacted to the critique. And it's a bit sad that it's only at that level that students are taught how to critique. So coming back to your point, I think if you're going to get peers to give improvement feedback, you have to deliberately teach them how to critique. There's an art in critique, and that's not necessarily developed by many kids. But on the other hand, as Graham Nuttall shows, students learn an incredible amount from other students. But then, as he also showed, that 80% of the feedback kids get is from other kids, and 80% of it's wrong. And the point I'm making here is it was a right time for engaging students, not at the content level where it's about right or wrong, because sadly, I remember more about you say as a colleague than what an expert would say. But at the time where multiple interpretations are needed, that's when we need peer talking, discussion, voice, involvement in commenting on assignments or whatever in terms of improvement. So my comment is there's a right time, there's a right place for peer feedback, for peer evaluation. I would hate to think we don't do it.
Yeah.
If anything else, right now, our employers want people who can critique and evaluate together. That's a skill we need to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, children talking to each other, listening to each other. So that's coming out actually as a really good thread in our conversation about the importance of listening. Now, before I knew you were writing the forward, I did put something in my book that was a sort of tribute to you, because you said you'd never found the holy grail of teaching and learning. And then I put in the book that I did. I think it was more of a sort of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but the point that I was making is when students become owners of their own learning, they take this ownership, they take responsibility, they're able to improve and reflect. Might not be the holy grail, maybe, but it's definitely a very special time when you see that. So yeah, Monty Python didn't find it. You said you haven't found it.
No, some advertising person came up with, actually it was Nigel Mansell in the first review in the Times, came up with that notion. And you're right, Monty Python didn't find it, I didn't find it either. But I want to stretch your claims just a slight step further, because here's the problem I have, and you deal with this throughout the book, is that sometimes people misunderstand what you say and say, therefore, students should be in control of their learning. It's about student agency. And part of that is kind of right, but a big part of that's wrong. Like the argument that I use to try and get around those kind of dilemmas is to say that our role as teachers is to teach students to become their own teachers, because that implies that it's okay to not know. It's okay to seek help. It's okay to use an expert. But the notion that, for example, and I know you don't say this, but students in control of their learning, they would never try anything new. They would never take risks. They would never fail. And that's a really serious problem. Like the majority of gifted kids never go on to be gifted adults because they get to the point where they can't afford to fail. They don't know how to fail, and they don't know what to do when they do fail. Whereas failure is the essence of learning. It's going into uncharted territory is the essence of learning. And there's lots of skills. And like when I look in classrooms and look at, and I just quite often in our work throughout the world, and I ask students about what do you do when you don't know what to do in this class? And virtually every kid says the same thing. I put up my hand and ask the teacher. Watch them. They don't. The kids who put their hand up know the answer or think they know the answer. Kids learn very quickly how to sit below the radar and look like they know and they don't know. And that's why this whole notion of helping them to become teachers. And surely that's what lifelong learning means. Surely that's what self-regulation means. And so I think that's the key. And that then, I think, sums up very effectively what you're talking about and where I also want to go. And I know Dylan also wants to go in this area. And during COVID, for example, those students who had those skills flourished in distance learning. Those teachers who knew how to release responsibility and teach the kids that did very well in distance learning. The biggest losers were those that highly depend on the teacher. They aren't their own teachers.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And we've spoken about the work of Carol Dweck before, and Dylan has said this about how it's been misunderstood, misapplied. And then listening to you talk about the failure element, that links in so well with her work. And even when I was getting feedback from Dylan in this book, right, and he was very, very thorough, and it was almost like I was in the student seat again. And it can be quite a personal, emotive thing, but then you have to sort of get past that and think, actually, this is really helpful, to the point where you're craving feedback because you just want it to be the best that it can possibly be. But there is this human element and emotion with it, which links in so well with Carol Dweck's work. So all of this is really well connected, your work, Dylan, and Dweck, and she's a friend of yours, isn't she? Yeah.
Well, a few years ago, a group here that I work with wanted a keynote speaker, and they all decided they wanted Carol. And it caused me a lot of angst because I thought, I think her work is totally misinterpreted many times. And I also knew from reading her work, she was very, very sharp. She was very, very smart. And I guess she didn't take prisoners from having watched some of her videos, but we'd never had really any contact other than emails. And so I emailed her and asked her, would she be prepared to come and be the keynote of this conference in a year's time, expecting no answer or a no. 23 seconds later, she replied and said, I'd love to. So I had about a year of angst trying to think of how do I actually say to her, your growth mind stuff is off the wall. And so I worked out this strategy because I knew I was meeting her and her husband, David, over at a meal at a very nice restaurant in Sydney. So I worked out a 3-course strategy. I went up to the restaurant. And so the first course was talking about how people misinterpret our work. And oh my goodness, she said, that's her whole life seems to be fixing the remedies. And she said, you must have that problem too. And I do. The number of people, I just got an article yesterday and it starts off by saying, he looks at every influence as if they're unique. Now, page 1 of the book says, this book is about the overlap. So they miss, anyway. So that was right. Second course. I plucked up the courage to say to her, Carol, I don't think there's any such thing as a growth mindset. Now her knife and fork stopped. The steely gaze came. And she said, John, a growth mindset is the most fixed mindset of the lot. I've never said this fixed in growth. She said, it depends. It depends on when, what they're doing, what's going on. She said, I spend my whole time putting it in context. And so I didn't wait for dessert. And as you do in fancy restaurants, I brought out a folder of every article she ever wrote. And I said, Carol, I think there's only one time when growth versus fixed matters. Listen to what you said. When kids are confused, when they don't understand, when they don't know, when there's high anxiety, and there's lack of confidence, then having a growth versus a fix really matters. She said, that's what I spent my whole life saying. She said, I wrote the first program, Brainology. She said it failed miserably because Kids loved it. Parents loved it. They all talked about not yet and right braining brain. She said, but then they went back to class, had a difficult math problem or a difficult music problem or a difficult phys ed problem, and they said, no, I can't do this. She said, there was no generalization. There was no transfer. And so she spent a whole life working out the context that matters, talking about challenge. Like one of her best studies ever, in my opinion, was the one she did looking at 3-year-olds and how they reacted with their parents to failure, and how that turned out to be an incredible predictor of later success. If failure was seen as a negative, those kids developed a very view that if you didn't succeed, you weren't part of the game. Well, that accounts for a lot of kids in our schools that are not part of the game. Those experiences early years. So I think Carol's work is excellent if we understand it right.
Yeah.
And I think, like you've tried to do in the book, I've tried to do, and I know many people have tried to do, is to get her story right. And
Yeah.
so I have a lot of time and respect for her.
Yeah, that's something that I'm really keen to do moving forwards. Is, I've heard comparisons with growth mindset and learning styles, and I think sadly this does happen in education, that's not the case, and it's difficult. Things get lost in translation, they get lost in the way. So yeah, hopefully we'll sort of keep clearing these things up and having these conversations and listening to each other about that, and actually listening to Carol Dweck and what the message that she is sharing. So yeah, thank
But the
you.
other thing that comes through your book, Kate, and comes through what you just said there too, is same with Carol's work. We must not deny the emotion of
Yeah.
learning.
Yeah.
It can be a struggle. It can have failure. It can be joyful. One of the things we're working on at the moment is the question is, how do you move? How do you know when to move from a focus on content, surface knowledge, to the deeper? And we're doing it through visualization. And we're doing eye camera, eyes gazing, face, and it's dramatically obvious in students when that aha moment. And the joy, sheer joy when they make discoveries. Oh my goodness, we need more of that in our classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to find out more about your wife's work as well. That sounds brilliant. That sounds really fascinating. I'm sure we can take a lot from that. But yeah, absolutely. The emotions, and especially now as we're going back, and I'm actually in the classroom after it's been a year online, which is emotionally draining. Zoom lessons. So yeah, and I'm so happy to talk to you again, and I feel what a dream team working with you, Dylan, Tom Sherrington. That was just a dream.
Well, I congratulate you on an incredibly good book, and I hope many people listen as they read it and listen to what you're saying in that, because it's very powerful.
Oh, thank you. Someone said to me, well, it's out next week, but some people have read it, and they said, do you ever need a reference or a referee? Because you can just use that quote from John Hattie and that'll get you whatever you need. But I love that you know a lot about Wales as well. Dylan and I spoke about that. Yes?
Yes,
Oh,
been there quite a few times, a wonderful part of the world. I'm balancing it with my influence from Birmingham, so.
yes. Oh, well, that's good to know. But anyway, thank you again so much for your time, John.
As you are reading through these 5 key strategies for effective assessment, I want you to think how they are directly related to our math teaching practices. Number 1 aligns with our standards of math practice and thinking about what is our learning intention. We've been talking about it during this session about establishing that math goal. The second part also links directly to posing purposeful questions and facilitating meaningful math discourse. The third part is providing feedback, which is eliciting and using evidence of student thinking. Number 4, activating students as owners of their own learning. That's where we support them in their productive struggle. And the last one is activating students as instructional resources for each other. And again, this is where we learn to facilitate meaningful discourse so that students are the teachers for each other, and we are the guides to help them work with each other to learn different ways of thinking and sharing other ideas. Take a moment to read this quote a few times. I think there are a couple really powerful parts to this, and they all begin with, they are only misconceptions when we begin with the expectation that others need to come to our way of thinking? How often do we rush in to help students because we want them to do it our way or the way that the book taught us? So, as you are reflecting on your current teaching practices and the way that we give feedback to students, I want you to think, what are the students actually doing? Not what I want them to do and not what I think that they are doing. So that's an opportunity for us as teachers to pause and let them deeply share their line of thinking so that we are not jumping in to rescue them. The first ways to gather evidence is a list of formative assessment ideas. If you click on it, there should be a link that pops up, and you can access that slideshow with a variety of options. The second place to check out more formative assessment ideas would be Chapter 4 in the Learning in the Fast Lane book to give you ideas for quick things that you can do in class to help inform your instruction and move forward with your students.